Good morning, everybody. I was one of those hands that went up as to whether you've seen the Northern Lights for the first time before, and last night was truly a dazzling sight, and I think reaffirms in many ways why we're all in this space together. So thank you to Carbfix for hosting us on such an opportune moment. My name is Vikrum Aiyer. I live out in California, and I'm with the direct air capture startup Heirloom. How many, just by a show of hands, are familiar or have heard of Heirloom before? Okay, fair amount. So I won't be patronizing and giving you the elementary explanation of what we want to do. But I do know that some of our conversation today, as was just mentioned, is going to focus on industry challenges, structural challenges, and a lot of both frustration, but also opportunity that we see in the road ahead. So this is going to sound like we've got all of our things in a row and we know everything that we're doing perfectly and everything's going brilliantly. And to some extent, that is a positive trajectory for Heirloom. But I do think that as the head of public policy for the company, I'm starting to see a lot of structural challenges when it comes to policy development, the pacing of government support, election swings that implicate things, and of course, financing. So I just want to both have a very commercial-oriented conversation about all the gains we've made, and then a very honest conversation about a lot of the struggles and challenges that we are prepared to fight together with all of you in this room. So on the technology itself, sounds like some of you are familiar with this already, but I just want to take us back to high school chemistry. I was a terrible chemist student. My parents are very disappointed in me that I am not a scientist. They would have preferred that I took the trajectory of the last speaker in life, but I'm going to bear with me as I explain this because it's quite simple. Someone even like me can understand it. Limestone is what we use to capture CO2 from the atmosphere. Many of you might be familiar with this. It's very earth abundant. About 4% of the Earth's surface is covered in limestone. It's in chalk, it's in toothpaste, pretty common to come across, and COVID supply chain shocks did not jolt the price of limestone. So what some PhD research from my colleagues, Noah McQueen and others that you might be familiar with, looked into was if limestone is made up of a certain chemical compound, how can we supercharge that compound and natural processes so that way it binds to more atmospheric CO2? So limestone has calcium and carbonates, it's CaCO3. What our process does is heat it up and induce a process by which that chemical equation goes from CaCO3 to CaCO2. It loses a molecule of carbon. So that high school chemistry teacher would remind me that if you take one molecule out of a chemical equation in order to rebalance it, it wants to reinsert that molecule of carbon. And that's simply what we do. We crush up limestone, we heat it up on an electric kiln, and then we place it on these trays. I'm going to show you a picture of what the trays actually look like, but just for this infographic, the trays are then stacked vertically, and just by being exposed to the atmospheric or ambient air, it starts to glob onto far more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we took out in the first place. And we just loop that process over and over. Luckily, thus far, we have not seen any degradation from the limestone as a feedstock, so we have been able to loop it over and over for our first facility that we are running right now out in California, but we will continue to monitor that to see how much limestone we might generally need over time. Now, I think that for Heirloom, this technology proved out that it worked when we just crushed up limestone and put it on the same kind of tray you'd bake cookies on at home back in 2021. We've since evolved that a bit, going from lab scale to commercial scale. But one of the biggest breakthroughs for us was being able to, in February of 2023, last year announced that some of the Bay Area air that we captured nearby where I live, were able to pull down CO2, mineralize it into concrete, and then pour that concrete back into infrastructure projects. I actually went to transportation infrastructure and housing projects in a city called San Jose, California. That's a big deal for us, not because of what the Carbfix community already knows, that mineralization-based storage is a huge path forward for the global economy, but it's also a big deal just in terms of the storytelling, just in terms of being able to showcase that this tech works, and it doesn't always need to be stored in formats that might seem unfamiliar or unclear, or maybe even to some community members scary. And that has been a big, big step forward for us. But I have to be honest, as you all know well in this room, for the amount of CO2 we need to remove, for us in California California, there's not a sufficient amount of cement or concrete to store that CO2 in. So we are given, and we are having to deal with, the reality of the EPA's preferred storage regulatory format, which is the geologic Class 6 well, which I know many of you heard from the EPA directly yesterday. So I just wanted to put this out there that our R&D experimentation and our path to commercialization is constantly trying to push the narrative on storage-based R&D, but we're also contending with the fact that as a US company, we have one main regulatory format. And some of you in this room today, including my team at Heirloom and other groups that are advocating in front of Congress and the Environmental Protection Agency, have been trying to push for different formats along the way when it comes to different storage capacities in the US. But I think that's going to continue to be a long road and one of the challenges that I want to unpack in our conversation. Luckily for us, and this is sort of the commercial everything's going well part, we've been able to sign a lot of positive offtake agreements. We've been able to ink deals with companies like Microsoft, like Stripe, some of the collective buyers. But on the panel, I want to talk a little bit about whether relying on the do-goodery of just a few tech companies and Fortune 100 companies is sufficient to really unlock the demand and the scale that we need to really push carbon removals along and really get the additional funding that we need as a company. I will say that in addition to our first facility that we launched in California last year, it is removing up to 1,000 tons of CO2 per year. It is fully built by union labor, so it's paying labor wages. It is relying on wind and solar energy, and it is completely divorced from any enhanced oil recovery effort. When you launch a facility like that with those attributes and those elements, it really plays well, just to be honest in this room, with the democratic leanings of a state like California. But then we were fortunate with Climeworks and other peers in the industry known as Battelle to win federal funding under the Biden administration's infrastructure law to go from that 1,000 ton per year facility in California to 2 new facilities out in Louisiana, a very different part of the United States. We won federal funding up to $600 million to build one of the first megaton facilities alongside Climeworks in a portion of Louisiana that is quite different. And at that same location, we're going to be building another facility that will be privately funded. So to go from 1,000 tons to 20,000 tons per year to 100,000 tons per year is pretty significant and fast commercial scale. And we are very proud of that. But I think part of that ease and capability comes down to we're just putting more rocks on trays. We stack them even higher in the sky, as you can see here, and that allows us to pull down more CO2. It's repeatable, it's scalable, it's modular, and we're already seeing our cost curve come down. So that's the very positive story for us. But I do just want to call out one last thing, and I'll stop rambling and hand the mic over. When it comes to signing offtake agreements, when it comes to being able to win government funding, when it comes to being able to use venture capital, for example, to build early stage facilities, there has been incredible progress in the last few years, right? This room has made that progress happen. The Carbfix team has made incredible progress happen when it comes to storage and regulatory formats. But we have a long road to go. Challenge number 1 for a company like ours, we've got an election. Y'all are pretty aware. That election doesn't necessarily make a pendulum swing on important gains like in our tax code on 45Q or funding that we've benefited from. But what it does do is it changes the narrative of how we talk about this. Talking about this in Louisiana to a Republican governor versus in California requires a little bit of artful narrative building in the same way that the European Union has been contending with more of a narrative on competitiveness. And I just think that's important to name as a community because how we message this is going to be a huge difference maker in how we're able to continue to fund, capture, and storage technologies. Second, we really do need, at least in America, to supercharge the storage conversation. The well-based storage system, or even an eventual path to a basalt-based storage system, needs additional funding and support from the EPA. And finally, when it comes to financing, it is one thing to win a fair amount of government money and some venture capital money, but ultimately, you need to be sure that in order to bridge some of these early scale facilities to later scale facilities, you need to have way more financing in the system. And I think opportunities in the EU through the ETS and opportunities that we'll talk about at the state level and the federal level when it comes to additional funding for procurement or additional compliance schemes are all going to be super critical to get to this next stage as an industry.
All right.
Thank you.
Vikram. Okay, our next lightning talk, Sandra.